Okay, so let's start with the Denver Nuggets. So the Denver Nuggets beat the Los Angeles Lakers 113 to 111 in game 4 in Los Angeles. That is a sweep. And I think it's just worth diving into the way that this team was built. I've talked a lot about the X's and O's of that series at this point. Los Angeles just never came up with any sort of answer for Denver defensively. I do think there is something to the idea that the shortened time between games, the 1 day rest between every single game, definitely played a role for an older Lakers team, particularly for LeBron James, who was absolutely outstanding in game 4, scoring 40 points, 10 rebounds, 9 assists, played phenomenally well. But like, it just feels like it was hard for LeBron to get separation in the way we've seen LeBron before. It felt like it was a little bit tougher for him to get the consistent penetration we've seen from him previously. It just felt like pulling teeth a little bit on offense for the Lakers at times in this series. But I think that's credit to Denver, and I want to talk a little bit about how Denver built this thing now. And obviously it all starts with Nikola Jokic. And I'm not going to ask you the stupid ass question like, did you ever see this from Nikola Jokic when he was a prospect? I'll ask you this. At what point did you believe that Nikola Jokic wasn't just like a good, all-star level NBA player, but could be this good and take a team to an NBA finals?
That's a really good question. That's such a good question. I want to say it was during his second year, honestly. Like that's, when
Wow.
or not like to take a team to the NBA finals or say, but I mean like that he could
Yeah.
become a superstar. I think when you were just watching him play, one of the things that I think for me, and this is not to say that I'm special, I just think this is just how I compartmentalize it. Like when I watch a guy where I've just never seen anybody like them before, I don't know how to like put them in my head. And it just works. Like that's to me, like that is how I would say I categorize superstardom to a lot of people. Like, and I think it's one of the things that's tried to make me rethink how I look at things in the draft from time to time because it's like, all right, well, it's funky, it's weird, but also it's incredibly effective. I've just never really seen it before, at least not at a high level. So, like, what does that mean? What do you take from this? And I think to me, yeah, like I look at that back end of Denver's season in 2016, 2017, when he becomes a full-time starter after kind of, playing as the first man off the bench for a lot of the beginning of the season. And then he's ripping off all these triple doubles. He's scoring 40 points in multiple games. Like I think he scored I pulled it up right now. He scored double digits in March every single game except for one. And like I think that's to me, like, and especially knowing what that roster was at the time, like they were interesting but not good like that. I would actually love to talk more about like just that roster in general and how they got to this point. But I think for me, like becoming like the best player in basketball, I don't know if I saw that, but I think the bones of like this guy could be a top 10 player in the NBA. Like I think that we saw that for the first time in 2017 is where I'm at.
I think the bones of it is right. In 2017, I mean, 2016-17 is the year they traded Yusuf Nurkic, right? And it's clear that trade was to clear out the space for Nikola Jokic to be able to develop into this kind of player that he became. I was a late adopter on Jokic.
Yeah.
I was fucking wrong on this because this tends to like not be my player type. And I tend to be a little bit late on outliers in this way. I saw the vision, I saw the feel, I got all of that. I also was just worried about like the conditioning, and then I'd be worried about the ability to consistently score on the interior. I knew he had great touch, but like wasn't really shooting from 3 yet at that point either. And really, even up until what I would say the first MVP year was like the first year he was truly consistent. as like a shooter from distance.
Mhm.
I will say that like I definitely bought all-star upside by like year 3 at least. Uh I got the talent there, but I was late on Jokic in like a real way in terms of like being able to be an MVP candidate at the very least. I think Denver fans thought this dude was like an MVP candidate. Certainly not in 2017, but honestly, I would say like the first All-Star year in like 2018, 19. I think at that point they realized like this isn't just like a great NBA player that's an All-Star. Like Adam Mares, like the guys over there, like they really truly believed in Jokic as not just being a good player, but being like a genuinely, truly elite player in the NBA. And yeah, I mean, it's a credit to them. And by the way, the other people that believed are the Nuggets front office. Like they felt like they really had something here. And it's just fascinating. I mean, look, you said like you wanted to look at that 2016-17 roster, and
It is a roster. Like, oh man.
it's a fascinating group, right? And like, you know, that is what, third year Gary Harris. It's
Let me just
third
pull it up
year.
right now. It's Danilo Gallinari still.
Yep.
Gary Harris, like you mentioned, I think second or third year Gary Harris, who never forget Gary. Like I was one of the people. I was a late adopter on Jamal Murray. I liked Jamal Murray. I thought he was gonna be good. He took a minute
Yeah.
to get going, and Gary looked like a future All Star. Like he was so good. But yeah, Wilson Chandler, Will Barton, Jameer Nelson is starting games for them. Like age 34, 35, Jameer Nelson is starting games.
Yeah.
Emmanuel Mudiay, never
Yep.
forget. Mason Plumlee's on that team after a trade. Obviously Jamal in his rookie year. Kenneth Faried is still playing minutes for them. Nurk, Darrell Arthur is playing real minutes. Wancho was playing minutes. Like that
Mike
was,
Miller is on this roster, by the way.
yeah. This was a team. Like it was certainly a team. But I think like they were in such an odd place because I loved the Nuggets so much because they were like, you know me, like I love those guys who are kind of fringy. Like Wilson
Yeah.
Chandler is one of my like 10, 15 favorite NBA players of all time. He was just super fun. Honestly, like it sounds so wild to say, but like I think he was like 5 years too late in getting
I
drafted.
love it.
Like straight up, like no, dude, watching his New York Knicks highlights are that's my favorite shit. I love it. Those Knicks teams were so like blah, but he was just really fun. Yeah, I think he went like what, like 39th in his draft, and I think he averaged 14 or 15 as a rookie. It was just fun, man. Really fun player. But point being, when
Well, I think the point here is this is very clearly a Nuggets team in between eras, right? Like these are like, this is remnants of the Carmelo Anthony trade mixed with like Jamal Murray, Malik Beasley, Nikola Jokic, you know, the guys they drafted after that, right? As they were trying to rebuild and transition into it.
mm-hmm.
And I think that like this is where the big word for them is like patience. Like this was just a super patient build, a very patient organization that was willing to let Nikola Jokic build into the player that he was. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about like Jokic and their process, like for drafting and evaluating him, just because like I literally wrote what is probably the definitive story about that at this point. Talked to like Tim Connolly, Misko Raznatovic, like literally like everybody associated with Jokic from like pre-draft, Hoop Summit, everything like that. I don't know if people remember this, but like, and this is what I led that article with that I wrote a couple years ago. Like a week before the draft, on the day that is like the early entry date for international players, Misko Raznatovic, who is Jokic's agent, tweeted, Nikola Jokic will be withdrawing from the 2024 NBA draft. And wow. Essentially, Jokic, the thing was like that Mishko, like I guess, didn't have a guarantee for Jokic, right? And he did this to kind of try and build like excitement, to try and be like, see if any team would come out of the woodwork and be like, no, this is the guy that we want. And this was after, if people remember, the 2014 Nike Hoop Summit, where he came in and was like, kind of frankly, an afterthought at that Hoop Summit. Like, he was by far not like the most relevant player at that Hoop Summit. So like, looking back at that Nike Hoop Summit roster, he was not even the most relevant player to end up as a first round pick for the Denver Nuggets, or as a draft pick from the Denver Nuggets on the world team, because that was Emmanuel Mudiay, who went 7th overall in the I guess that would have been 2014 or 2015. It would have been 2015 NBA draft. Mm-hmm. So like, you go back through this roster and just counting the number of players that people were more excited about than Nikola Jokic. Cliff Alexander, Stanley Johnson, Tyus Jones, Jahlil Okafor, Kelly Oubre for sure, Miles Turner, Justice Winslow. That's like 7 guys there. On the world team, honestly, they were more excited about seeing Clint Capella at that point. Damian Inglis, do you remember Damian Inglis, the like super long arm guy that ended up playing for the Bucks? He ended up playing super well at that Hoop Summit and like earning like an early 2nd round pick. I think he went ahead of Nikola Jokic in that draft. Trey Lyles was like a 5-star kid. Emmanuel Mudiay, that's 10. Jamal Murray, that's 11. And then Karl Towns is 12, who was on that roster. There are literally a dozen players, maybe more, that NBA teams were more interested in seeing than Nikola Jokic. And then you see this dude come in and he's just slicing dudes in ball screens with Nikola Jokic. Like, it was awesome. It was super, super impressive to see it happen. And that's what ended up earning him the notice of NBA scouts. And Denver, Tim Connolly was at that event. And he told me about how he gets into a car with Arturas Karnisovas, who was their assistant GM at the time, now the head of basketball operations for the Bulls. And he goes, oh my God, like Jokic is killing these dudes out here. And he still was like 250 pounds, 6'10", kind of pudgy, like kind of like not in shape at all. And even after he sliced and diced those dudes all week in practice, there was like no excitement really about him in the gym. That's how he ends up going 42 or whatever he goes. But fast forward to like the week before the draft, Mishko says he's pulling him out. And I tweeted about this earlier this week, but like, obviously you can't really do like quote unquote promises or anything, but they called Mishko and like expressed their disappointment that Jokic would be pulling out of the draft. And ultimately, the reason that Raznatovic like trusted the Nuggets, that what they said would happen, right? Because so much of the draft process is about trust for these guys that are stash picks and these guys that are international players. So much of this is about trust. Do you know why Excel, Bayo Basket, Mishko Raznatovic ultimately trusted the Denver Nuggets to select Nikola Jokic and like believed in him? It was because the year before, the Nuggets had taken, or I think they traded for him on draft night, Joffrey Laverne at like 55 or 53. Yeah. And like Joffrey was never going to be like some, high level, elite level NBA player, but they did right by Joffrey Laverne and like were on top of him the whole year that he was like overseas, and like really took care of him and like really were all in on him essentially. And like confirmed that like, look, we pay attention. We care about our guys. Like, we're not just going to leave him overseas and not pay attention to him. Like, we're going to actually make sure and be engaged on that front. So literally the reason that the Denver Nuggets end up with Nikola Jokic, in many ways, one of the significant reasons is because they took Joffrey Laverne at 50, 55, 53, whatever they took him at that year in the previous draft. That's crazy. Like, all of the little decisions that NBA organizations make, they add up. You can't take shortcuts. Like, you can't do these little cost-cutting measures. You can't do these things, right? And because they didn't, because they were so engaged on that front and they did right by one player, they end up with a superstar. And obviously they evaluated him well. They had him as a first-round pick that year. They told me, like, they really liked him. But they also took Yusuf Nurkic and Gary Harris ahead of him in that draft. Like, it's not like they were geniuses. It's just that they got one thing right after they took care of a guy the previous year. And they were able to build that trust to be able to keep Jokic in the draft. All the little things matter. That's the important thing here. All of the little things matter. And I think that little decision is emblematic of how this Denver Nuggets roster was built in many ways.
Yeah, there's so many things to pick apart with that's so fascinating. I didn't know that you wrote that. You're gonna have to link that to me because I never read that before. That's fascinating. I think, like, part of what was fun for me in going back and looking at all this, because especially with Melo retiring, and just them making the finals in general for the first time in my life, I just thought about it so much, and I put it out as, like, just a meme and a joke on Twitter, but also seriously. You know how much I love Paul Millsap. Like, I put out the domino of, like, the small domino of Paul Millsap 3 for 90, July 2nd, 2017. And then the big domino is 2023 finals appearance. And, like, it sounds ridiculous, but like you mentioned, the small things happening. For me, at least in my lifetime, Paul was the biggest free agent that I'd ever signed in Denver during my life. Like, legitimately. And I think it's easy to forget because he is, much like everybody who played on that Atlanta team, really quiet, like, not a big media guy, just, from everything I've heard, actually awesome dude around Atlanta. He's still in Atlanta now, does a ton of stuff there, but, like, just was really quiet. Like, so people didn't really, like, I mean, he wasn't flashy, but, like, again, like, someone who I wish got drafted like 10 years later, because good God, can you imagine him today? But point being, like, legitimate all-star, borderline all-NBA guy signs a near max deal to go play in Denver on, I believe it was the team. So it was before the team. They went 40 and 42 that year with Jokic. When they started to really come on, they had the young talent. They really didn't have that vet who pushes them over the top. He goes there, and I just, like, having that one guy who commits to going somewhere is so massive.
Yep.
It sounds like such a minor thing, but, like, being able to get that top 25 talent who helps, like, reinforce your foundation and up the floor and the ceiling simultaneously is huge. And I think it's, like, easy to lose sight of because he wasn't a big focal point by the time they got to their contending stage. But I genuinely don't think that they get there without him. And I think that just brings up so much more for them from where they go, you know, and it's all the other things like you're mentioning, like their patience is kind of wild. Like, and I think it's less to just say, like, oh, well, this is the greatest organization of all time, more just like, it's so different now. Like, I think part of it probably is, like, they just have, you can say a lot of things about the Kroenkes for sure as an ownership group and what they do or don't do with their money. But I think, like, looking at this overall, like, you just don't find very often now where a team is able to take 6 years to build something. And it's not that they built this with 6 years in mind. Like, they got absolutely smashed with injuries. And I think that got so undersold in the background, like, how much injuries really hurt this team. Like, and I'm not just trying to go to bat for them. I think, like, I mean, they have legitimately poor showings in the playoffs, but the point is, you don't get the chance to shit the bed in the playoffs more than once most of the time. And, like, I still think, like, when you look at what happened against Phoenix, that's so much more about who they didn't have and Phoenix being good. And you look at all these other things, like, okay, well, the Aaron Gordon trade happens and that team looked like a title contender right there, right then, over that like 8-game stretch before Jamal gets injured. And then, okay, that happens and it's the bubble. It's like, oh, well, damn, that's kind of out the window. We'll see what happens next year. MPJ gets injured after, like, again, easy to forget, like, MPJ averaged what, like 30 and 8 on like 70% true shooting, like the last 35 games of that season. Like, it literally looked like he's like on the verge of this guy. If he just doesn't get injured, he's going to be an all NBA player. Gets injured the next year. So like, it's just this confluence of all these little things where like they still built into being a very good team, but had always like that thing that pushed them away from becoming a great team. And like, easy to forget about. And I'm not just saying this because I love the dude, but like Gary Harris's injury and fall off was huge, man. Like, especially with Jamal, like I really don't think Jamal super established himself until like year 3, 4, like starting to really become that guy. The consistency was always a thing. I still think like the consistency, we finally have hit that point in like the last year or two where he got to that. But like we mentioned, like even when it looked like Gary might not be an all-star guy, like it was like, okay, well, we have this dude who shoots 40% from 3, is an all defense level guy. That's perfect. Like, we need that. And then his, like, I've talked to so many people in Denver about like what the hell happened. Like, I think a lot of it was just confluence of 8 million lower body injuries happening. And it's been awesome to see his shot come back around, but like his offense just died and he became like borderline, not unplayable because they needed him defensively, but he was so hard to have on the court offensively with where he was at. And like, when you look at exactly like you mentioned, just like when you have all those guys, like the Emmanuel Mudiay pick did not work at all. And just having the way that this stuff played out it is fascinating to go back and look at. And you can go even farther and look like, okay, the 57-win Andre Iguodala team after the Carmelo trade happens.
Yep.
And then Andre bounces, not saying it was right or wrong, but he does. And that team, George Karl gets fired, the Brian Shaw era. I'm not old enough to really have thoughts on what he was as a coach, but that era does not work out at all. And then they just become this kind of like hodgepodge of, we have guys who can play basketball and they're kind of,
well,
like
that's what the post Carmelo Anthony was, like hodgepodge of guys that can play basketball. And they just like kind of continued to find guys that were good. Like, I think that's what this front office like always did. Like, seriously, like throughout the conversation I had with Tim Connolly, like when I wrote this Jokic thing, as they were building this thing, because the core is basically the same outside of the Aaron Gordon move. I don't think they had Aaron Gordon by 2021. Maybe they did by the end of the year. I can't remember. But like they're so upfront with you. Like, look, we think we do a good job of evaluating, but like, this is luck. Like, so much of this, like hitting on Jokic is luck. Like, we missed on Emmanuel Mudiay. Like they missed on a couple of players. Like, they missed less than other teams do. And I think that's what matters. But like, their goal was like, we're going to take good people that we want to have in the organization and just continue to slowly, methodically build. And I think that the good people aspect of it cannot go understated. Having good dudes around that are good with being around one another is a critical piece of this, because we can talk all we want about this like slow, methodical build, right? And just like going down the road and like continuing to get the guys that you want, continuing to evaluate well. If you don't find the right mix of personalities and human beings that can stand to be around one another for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, as this thing builds, you're going to have to move them. And your whole build then changes. Your whole idea of what this roster can be changes. And I think that like, that's where, frankly, like, let's be real about this one. Like, there were questions about Michael Porter Jr. coming out of college in terms of this, in terms of like, what kind of person is he? Not to say like it was a terrible, like off the court, but like what kind of locker room presence is he going to be, especially if he's not the primary option, right? Because all throughout Michael Porter's career at that point, He'd been the guy. He'd been the dude. He was a top 3 prospect in his class. He was unbelievable. What Denver nailed in terms of evaluation, he'd be good with that. We didn't know that at the time, but they nailed the fact that he would be good with that, and that he would be good winning and being on a winning team and being that guy. And shout out to Michael Porter for being willing to be that guy and for proving, anybody that had questions about him in that regard wrong, because they existed. And shout out to, Jamal Murray. Like, Jamal Murray's always a guy that, like, people thought would be like a great character guy. Shout out to, Aaron Gordon, another guy that's like an unbelievable character guy. You look up and down the roster, and they've just done this tremendous job of finding these core pieces that were going to be good with being around one another for so long. Like that was, again, like when I talked to Tim for that story, like that was such a big part of what he told. Like, it was, we need to find people that will allow us to build in this way. Like, they really, truly cared about the human aspect of it. And because of that, they were able to make this slow, methodical build. And I think that's huge.
Yeah, no, definitely, man. I couldn't agree more.
The other thing is, like, Denver, I think, did a really good job of evaluating skill sets that are untraditional. So, like, one of the things that Tim Connolly told me is, like, I asked them specifically, like, is there something that Nikola Jokic did that you can pinpoint that you guys really connected to in the pre-draft process that you thought was like an undervalued part of his game, or like an undervalued, like a marginal inefficiency for him as a prospect? And he was like, look, I've thought about this a lot, essentially, is what he said. And I think I can pinpoint like 2 things. So first, he has the quickest, best hands that you will ever find, like, in a person. Like, his hands are unbelievable. He told me his hands are unbelievably underrated. They allow him to be a solid defender without elite length. He has good length, but not elite length. He has the ability to play without any ability to play above the rim. Also, they say the best baseball hitters, like Ted Williams, could see the seams of a baseball. I think he processes things that quickly, but is able to also play at his own speed. Nikola's almost like an algorithm. He sees it, mental snapshot, he's able to do it. He never gets sped up, and he's almost never out of options. Most guys, first move, second move, by the time they hit the third move, they're falling over and they have no outs. Every time he catches the ball, he has 15 outs. And I think that's genius. And then, like, being willing to, like, have that guy, and then having Jamal Murray as a point guard for that guy that, like, fits perfectly. And then understanding that Michael Porter Jr. would be the perfect off-ball scorer for him because he's an awesome cutter and because he's a terrific shooter. And then understanding that the perfect guy in between them is Aaron Gordon, and deciding, you know what, we're going to overpay to acquire Aaron Gordon on the trade market, because at the end of the day, this is the exact player that we need in between these 2 guys. It's just all brilliant across the board. I think that every NBA title contender, essentially, any NBA team that reaches this height, there's so much more luck involved with it than people like to say. These things hang like on a fucking shoestring in terms of they could go one way or another, and you never know. I think Denver, obviously, there are a number of moments where this could have gone wrong. Injuries, as you mentioned, I think is a huge critical factor here. But the fact that they were able to pinpoint the exact players that fit around their stars after they evaluated the star, I think is just so, so crazy, impressive, and valuable.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, like, hitting on the secondary stuff is almost more important than hitting on the star player, because I think like it's easy to find the star talent. Obviously, I think with Jokic that was different, but in general, like I think it's very difficult to. I mean, we've just seen so many people struggle to put the right talent around guys, and I think like just to answer a question in the pod, not in the pod, in the comments, like from I think S. Bahraini put, like how important do you think that the character evaluation is in the draft? And I think like this is not to sound like on my soapbox, but I think part of the thing where I've really started to just diverge so much from quote unquote draft Twitter is like understanding how much that stuff has to play in. Like talent is incredibly important, but the ability to unlock potential, so much of that is about being in the right environment, being able to adapt to that environment, and willingness. And like that is very much something you have to scout and know. Like anybody you talk to in a front office or on a coaching staff or a player development staff is going to talk about how important ability to adapt is, because so many of these guys are coming out of being, a star-ish level player, having that kind of usage to having to figure out what they are at the next level. And that's just really damn tough for people to do. So I think it's incredibly important. And like you mentioned, like, honestly, what was so fun about watching the way the Nuggets built stuff, they did a much better job of drafting for role than drafting for stars. Like, obviously, like, I mean, we mentioned with Moutier, I think, and that's not to be unfair to him, like more stuff happened than just that, but like he was a pretty raw prospect in that regard. But like, I mean, you look at what they did role wise, like, okay, the Tyler Lydon pick sucked, but like everything else you look at, like, okay, they have Trey, like Trey Lyles ended up becoming a really solid, even though he didn't end up going there. Like,
well, like we're going to get obliterated for this, but like Denver fans look back on that and they're like, we could have had Donovan Mitchell because they traded the Donovan Mitchell pick for Tyler Lydon and Trey Lyles, essentially.
Yeah.
Look, that's another example of how this thing hangs on a shoestring, right?
Yeah.
Like,
well, like exactly that's the point. Like they didn't do a good job of drafting stars, but other than Nikola, but
like here's the thing, they kind of did. Like they drafted Jokic, they drafted Murray, and they drafted Michael Porter. Like they were the team that took the risk on Michael Porter, despite the back concerns that he had pre-draft, right? Michael Porter should have gone top 5 in the draft if he didn't have the back concerns, right?
Oh, for sure.
I had him, even with the back concerns, I had him at 6 on my board. And I was like, this guy's just like such an immense talent that we have to take a flyer on it. But like, that's like a real, like they were the team that evaluated that like the risk is worth the reward here on Michael Porter. And they went for it and they nailed it. Like they got the most out of that pick. So like, I know what you're saying. You're right. Like they missed Emmanuel Mudiay. They missed on Mitchell. Like they missed on a few other guys. But like they did the Tyler Lydon pick. It just goes to show you're never going to get everything right. Like building a roster is so fucking hard in the NBA. You are never going to get everything right at the end of the day. You're just not. But it's how you bounce back from that and how you give yourself outs in terms of versatility. I think Denver did a really good job of giving itself outs. And because they gave themselves outs, they really allowed themselves the ability to be patient on a lot of levels.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think like you mentioned, hitting on everything is just not attainable. Like I think anytime that part of what is almost humbling at times in talking to in talking to people who work in front offices and stuff is like recognizing and I don't think it's everyone. I do think that a lot of times in sports, there's way too much like, well, you got to be the best mindset. But like, I do think there is legitimately like a pretty good understanding of in the best front offices, like we're not going to be perfect. We just have to roll with the punches and do our best. And I think that stands out.
No, I think that's absolutely right. It's huge. Just in terms of the way they built the rest of this roster out, they draft Nikola Jokic, they draft Jamal Murray. Jokic stays overseas for a year, by the way, goes from what he was to Adriatic League MVP. in his pre-draft year, which is just fucking bonkers for a teenager to win Adriatic League MVP, essentially. Because he was stashed, they ended up being pretty poor the next year. They draft Jamal Murray 2 years later, 2015 or 2016 for Jamal Murray. I can't remember.
I think it was 2015. I want to say.
Yeah, let me I'll keep talking as we're going here. But they draft Jamal Murray in,
he was 2016. Yeah, he's
2016 draft. Then they draft Michael Porter Jr. in 2018. And that's like the core group of this team. But meanwhile, throughout that time, prior to the Michael Porter draft in 2018, they go 46 and 36, as you mentioned, that year. And they finish 9th in the West, which allows them to continue to stay in the lottery and end up with Michael Porter Jr. So they're building this team, still winning games while building this team, but they're building the team out in like a real tangible way. That 2018 roster, Gary Harris, Will Barton, Nikola Jokic, Jamal Murray, Wilson Chandler, Paul Millsap. The trade for Yusuf Nurkic ended up being Mason Plumlee, and I think a first for Nurkic and a second, if memory serves.
I think so.
They still have Emmanuel Mudiay on the roster. And then 2018 hits, and that's where like Jokic goes supernova. Jamal Murray takes a leap immediately. Gary Harris becomes like a really high level 3-and-D guard. The other guy that's like sneaky important, I think, as well, is they hit on the Monte Morris pick too.
Mm-hmm.
Monte Morris is a guy that they take in 2017, and he ends up being like one of the best backup point guards in the NBA. Another guy, by the way, where they hit on some really, really sharp, undervalued assets, taking him in the 50s. He's like a 6'1" guard, but he could really shoot. And he was like the best decision maker in college basketball, like set the record for assist to turnover ratio in college basketball that season, and was like incredible and unbelievable. Then after that, you end up in a circumstance where they also take Malik Beasley, right? Like Malik Beasley ends up being like a trade asset on some level for them. And the other guy that I think is like somewhat important to note here is Jeremy Grant's on this roster for a year, right?
That is so easy to forget. Like, I mean that respectfully, but like, yeah, it's
no, of course. But I think that what's important about this part of it is that Jeremy Grant is like kind of the test drive for Aaron Gordon in some ways, right? Like they have this, Jeremy Grant come in after trading for him, and they realize that like, oh my God, like this is perfect. Like we have this guy who can like really crash and like play defense and be able to be energetic. Jeremy Grant that played for the Denver Nuggets was drastically different than the Jeremy Grant that we know now, playing for Portland and playing for even Detroit a couple years ago. He was like crashing the glass. He was almost like a big as opposed to a wing. Like he was a center at times in small ball lineups, and was like huge for them, like switchable, athletic, energetic. And I think that getting him allowed them to know we can go, they lose him in free agency, but getting him allowed them to know we can go all in on Aaron Gordon and we can feel good about it and feel like this is the exact guy that fits, because we've seen this before. Like there's no real risk here for like, we know Aaron's the guy that like fits our roster and works. So I think that's huge. They also obviously drafted Jared Vanderbilt as well. Like Jared like didn't play a ton in 2020 at all, but like that's an important thing as well. Like that's another asset for them, another valuable player that like literally they just played in the playoffs and started multiple games. It's just, they nailed the big decisions. They nailed the little decisions. Even someone like PJ Dozier was like really good prior to tearing his ACL again that year. And like PJ is a guy that had injury concerns coming out of South Carolina as well. That's why he goes undrafted, but like they took a real shot on him. It worked out. They were just willing to take like injury flyers on guys. And guys with like, yellow flags in the draft process, or maybe even they were flagged by some teams red, right? Like do not draft. They were a little bit more open to taking those chances, I think. And then, they do acquire, Aaron Gordon in 2021, and that essentially is the core. They're, Jokic, Jamal Murray, Aaron Gordon, and Michael Porter Jr. That's your foursome, and you're going to ride with it. And then unfortunately, like Mark said, they get hurt. Last season, they were just really all over the place. It was hard for Jokic. He didn't have Jamal Murray, didn't have Porter. They had no creation outside of him. They obviously like drafted Bones Highland as well. I think Bones is like categorized fairly as a miss, even though he's like a very clear talent. It's just that it didn't work within their front office, right? Or within their like locker room, seemingly on some level. It seems like Bones wanted a bigger role, and like reasonable. That's fine. But they move off of these guys that I think aren't fits pretty quickly as well.
Yeah.
And I think it's a credit to them again. And then this offseason came like kind of the final touches, right? So they get Kentavious Caldwell-Pope for that importantly aforementioned, Monte Morris pick, where it's Will Barton and Monte Morris for, Ish Smith and Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. And KCP is like the perfect defensive wing that can take some pressure off of Jamal Murray and can knock down shots from three and space the floor, and they can play 5 out while still having like playmakers and dribble pass shoot guys all over the court. They draft Christian Braun. Christian Braun is phenomenal and incredible in terms of being a role player that's athletic and has potential to shoot and like just be an energy guy. And then Jeff Green as well. Like Jeff Green is a guy that was like on the scrap heap for a while and like was getting minimum contracts. And Jeff Green's their, 6th or 7th most important player now, 7th most important player now. So, and then the final piece of this is Bruce Brown, and Bruce Brown has been enormous for them as essentially a guy that can play with or without Jokic because of his playmaking ability, his increased confidence as a shooter, all of this. I think it's just absolutely enormous.
Yeah, no, it's interesting too, because I think so much of the year, even as good as they were, there were still questions like, oh, was the rotation good enough? Should they do this? Should they do that? Like, can they maybe add one more guy? And I think, obviously we've landed on it looks pretty good. But I think it's interesting too, because like you look at even down the way, like they tried to tweak things up. Like, easy to forget that Thomas Bryant and Reggie Jackson were acquired this season. Like,
yeah.
Given what their backup center situation was. And then they've basically just gone to the point of now it's like, hey, Jeff Green, small ball 5. Like, that's been the option now. It's like Jeff Green play the 5, play with Bruce Brown, play with just switchy and do more, because we cannot make this work with having 5 out there. Because I still I have Zeke Naji hopes long-term still, but like it hasn't happened. At least to the level that they want it to, like to be this level of team, it's hard to just be like, oh, well, we're going to figure it out. But yeah, man, it's looking at the turnover and the way things have gone has been really interesting.
Yeah. And, it is really interesting. Like, I've seen a couple of people, ask something like this in the comments: are players like Jokic and Draymond Green predictable or projectable for draft purposes? Or are players that change the paradigm just by definition something that can be recognized in hindsight? It's a great question. I think that I think that we often underrate elite skills. Like Draymond Green at Michigan State. So look, like Draymond Green was like heavy at Michigan State. And this is like, both of these guys are like the, shout out Ethan Strauss, whatever you think of them, right? Like Ethan Strauss had the idea of fat is potential in disguise, and like being a little bit heavy, I think does often become something that, can hide these things. The things that were recognizable about Draymond and Jokic were always the feel. They always had the feel stuff. And both of those guys, I think Jokic might've been the first year I did draft evaluation, like at all. And then Draymond was before I did it. So like, I can't sit here and like, be an expert on those guys, but I think that what I often look for is I try to understand who are the guys that genuinely have just like truly elite feel. Not just like good feel, but like, is there a chance that this player is just truly special in terms of the way that he sees the game that allows him to be successful? And you know, both Jokic and Draymond Green, they both like produced at exceptionally high levels. Like even Jokic in that pre-draft year where he was like 18, 19 playing for Mega, he was like not really a starter, but he played, I think it was, you know, like 20 to 22 minutes a night or something. And I think he averaged like 10 or 11 points and like a couple of assists and like 5 rebounds or something. Like for that age level, he was like very, very productive. And then he like exploded into being like the MVP of that league the next year.
Yeah, I think my answer to this is somewhere in between. Like I agree with you in the you got to look for like I think identifying what is elite and not just what's elite in the moment, but what translates as elite is probably what I think has been the hardest part. But I have had like saying some wins sounds like too much, but I think like for me, like I was so in on Herb Jones because I watched him play defense. And I was like,
Yeah, I did too.
there's no way that I can't like see this guy being at least the
Yep.
ninth man with how good that defense is. Like, because I think like
Yep.
his defense at Alabama always gets undersold sometimes. Anytime I see anybody compare a player to Herb Jones, I'm like, please rewatch what he did defensively at Alabama because that was
He
nuts.
was a joke. He was so good
Yeah,
on
it was
defense.
one of
By
the
the way,
best.
like sneaky guy in this year's class, not quite as good as Herb Jones, but Omax Prosper is filthy on defense.
He's really fun.
Yeah.
Shout out, man. I'm bummed that we're not going to get to watch that Marquette team fully assembled next year because that was so fun this year. But point being, like you mentioned, I think
Also,
spotting
Iguodara Hive assemble.
very fun college player that ends for me. But like I think like you mentioned, the spotting the elite skill I think is the most important. But I also think like part of it is the hindsight to a degree. Like, okay, I think the biggest thing with Draymond is like he's always going to be interlocked with Steph and Clay, and I think part of that is how can you have the foresight before the hindsight? Like, can you envision like one of the things that I'm trying to do right now? I'm not saying I'm going to be right or wrong, but like I'm going through and like really trying to pinpoint things on the women's side and looking at, okay, like Juju Watkins, who is not going to be draft eligible for 3 or 4 more years. Like, okay, well, what am I seeing? Who is this kid? There's this girl named Jersey Robinson who please remember that name. She's going to be unreal. Out of Los Angeles, who was, I believe, CIF Player of the Year as a freshman this year. Like she's like looking. How can you look and see what the game is molding towards 4 or 5 years from now? How can you merge that with where it is right now in the pros and where it's headed? And how can you kind of blend that together and try and envision it? And part of that, you're not going to be able to do that fully in the moment. I don't think that anybody could have really, like nobody had ever played the way that the Warriors had before at the pro level or in any level really. Like with that kind of pace, with that kind of spacing, with the kind of way that they built it, like there had been like versions of that built into it. But like to that point, like having it be like, this is what we do. This is our bread and butter. This is how we open everything up. Okay, well, how do you get to that point where you can see that kind of stuff beforehand? And I think like you can a little bit. You can have inklings and ideas, but I think it's more like I almost think of it like kind of like a spider web, or like when you look at like the Skyrim tech tree, like okay, you have to like in order to in order to unlock all these other things, you have to like branch out and look forward and backward to try and see things. And there's not really a great answer for it, but I think that's kind of where I'm at right now with it.
Well, and I think like this is where the future of team building kind of goes. Like every year it's like cyclical in terms of like what did the NBA finalists do that we didn't? What did X, Y, and Z do that we didn't? I look like drafting Nikola Jokic at 41, 42, whatever he went. That's like not truly attainable in my opinion, as a goal. Sure. But like once you get the star in place, what is attainable is how Denver went about building this roster. I think front offices will look at the way Denver did this and go, this is attainable. This is something we can do. We can pinpoint the Jamal Murray who can be the best second star. We can pinpoint, the injury risk that was Michael Porter Jr. We can pinpoint the perfect like crash role playing big man and a wing big and Aaron Gordon, right? And we can find players that fit all across our board. And I think that what we might see, and this is something I always talk about, yes, before you get the star, I am all for drafting just to find the star. And you have to find the number one option. That is you can't win in the NBA without that guy. You can't win in the NBA without the MVP candidate, without the guy who can be a top 10 player in the league, just straight up. But once you get that guy, what you put around him is incredibly fucking important. And it's why I don't really like, for instance, the way Toronto went about things with, its roster build in terms of just like having all these like weirdo length guys kind of. And it's why I love what Oklahoma City has done in terms of building around Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Like Toronto and Oklahoma City are like two different sides of the same coin in terms of like they draft super long, very big, positional size, guys that have good feel for the game, etc. The thing that Oklahoma City does differently, though, is they draft guys with super high level skill, with, guys that are, I'm not saying Toronto doesn't draft guys with great character, but like, they prioritize character at a super high level, and they draft guys that will work around their star players. Oklahoma City's build right now is like, this is the next in the iteration of the Denver build, in my opinion. This is the next team that's doing this. And Oklahoma City is probably 4 or 5 years away from winning a title, but they're the team that's doing this, in the way that they're doing it well. NBA Rigged, I think, asked a really good question here. Who are the 3 individuals most responsible for assembling the Denver Nuggets championship squad? Number 1 is Nikola Jokic, just straight up. Like, I get it that like you're asking about assembled, but like none of this happens without Nikola Jokic, right?
Oh, definitely not.
Yeah. Number 2 for me is Tim Connolly. And we haven't mentioned the name Tim Connolly a ton on this podcast, but I think he really deserves flowers. He built the majority of this team before moving on to Minnesota because he got like an enormous contract offer to run their basketball operations last summer. Shout out to Tim Connolly. I think he absolutely deserves the second most credit. The third guy is either Calvin Booth or it's Michael Malone. It's one of the two. I'm willing to listen on either. Both certainly played a role. The other guy that played a really important role is a guy that we mentioned earlier, Arturas Karnisovas, played a really important role in this in terms of evaluation and finding guys, and like his, relationships overseas and everything played a really critical role. But those are like the 4 or 5, I would say, that are like the most important by far.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. We already gave Millsap love, so I don't have to say him again, but he is the best. What else did I want to say? I did want to backtrack a little bit because I think our guy Esfandiar Bahraini asked another really great question. How much of this is also trying to nail a moving target? It's finding the right fit organizationally, plus trying to track bigger trends and hoops. Like Sam said, it feels like luck for a lot of it. I think part of what's so hard in it is that I don't like. In some ways, yes, on the nailing moving target part, but again, I think what gets undersold a lot is what is your organizational mandate and what kind of flexibility do you have within that? Because I think part of what's so important for OKC is they got the flexibility to do what they wanted to become a team that is going to be a perennial contender potentially if things really hit right, and I think it will. But like that's what's so difficult and again, like I think that's part of so much of when I first started this, I used to think everything had to be a certain way. Like there's a right or there's a wrong. And I think part of what makes it that much more difficult is that's just not true. Like that there's not a right or wrong way to do things. There's no way to, it's impossible to replicate things also too, with just something that is so vastly different all the time. But like, I mean, just continuing on that, like when you're looking at the Indiana Pacers, let's say, like if you take a team like that and you're talking about, like, oh, well, this team being a contender. Being a contender means something entirely different for the Indiana Pacers than it does for the Oklahoma City Thunder. Like, how you're going to get there, how that's possible, what kind of assets you're going to have to be able to do that, what kind of leeway you're going to have to be able to make that happen. Like, that's just that every team is different. So I think exactly like you're mentioning, that's what makes it tough. And I think I don't know a ton about Toronto's ownership, but I would imagine that's played a part in it as well. Like how much was Toronto really, not that they should have taken a step back after they won the title, but like, I don't know, like that's going to be interesting to see play out over the next year or so with them.
Yeah. I think Toronto does have, really strong patient ownership. Like I think that I'm not real worried about their ownership, but I will say that
I'm
like,
not saying I'm worried about them, but
like Denver's ownership deserves an immense amount of credit here, like for letting this thing ride a little bit. They also like there are organizations that would not have paid Michael Porter like a max to retain him. There are organizations that would not have paid Aaron Gordon that like $22 million extension number after paying 3 maxes in order to retain Aaron Gordon. And like, look, they've lost some guys along the way. Like, no question, every team has to make financial sacrifices on some level. But I do think it's really important to note, like, ownership is a big part of this. And like ownership is really, really, really critical in this case for Denver. They I feel like when we talk about ownership, we often talk about it like in a meddling manner or in some sort of like, concern trolling kind of thing where like, will the wrestlers actually pay to keep Atlanta together? Will, are the wrestlers too involved in Atlanta, or are, I should stop saying Atlanta because, that was just like one that came to mind, but like, certainly Matt Ishbia is the most recent new owner that came in, right? And seems to have a real degree of influence. The Cronkies let these guys go and really just build it. And it's huge and they deserve an immense amount of credit. I think that's all I've got on this. I will say, like, really impressive, really good work by the Denver Nuggets as an organization. That's all I've got, though, Mark. Do you have any other strong takes you have to get off here?
Okay. No, I think, that's it for me.